Hey reader, welcome back to the channel, and today we are continuing in our series looking at scenario objectives in Bolt Action 3rd Edition. Today looking at Top Secret. Now I suspect that Top Secret is one of those polarizing scenario objectives where either people really like it because it's interesting, it's different, it's not just kill stuff, move around, that sort of thing, or they really don't like it because it can become a very foregone conclusion sort of scenario very quickly. And to be fair, this is not unique to bolt action. For anybody who's been involved in the Middle Earth strategy battle game, your familiarity with the Heirlooms of Ages Past scenario, and various other style scenarios like it can be very difficult to balance in a game. And it's very difficult, especially when there's random factors involved that can result in somebody picking up or not picking up an objective and then losing or not losing that objective. It can be very difficult to balance. So to be clear, any negatives that I have about this or any recommended changes that I'm going to recommend, just, take it with a grain of salt that this is not specific to bolt action. Okay. And it's not that I think that bolt action dropped the ball on this. I just think this is a really, really hard ball to carry in a game. So to start off with, we're going to be looking at what are the victory conditions, look at which units perform well, which ones are more likely to struggle, which, by the way, as you're going through the series, does not mean that you shouldn't take them. It just means you might have to work a little bit harder in order to get them to work, because, just what the scenario requires is not what they are built to do, right? We'll look at deployment and terrain considerations and then some changes that I would recommend. So to start off with, first of all, over there on the right-hand side, you're going to see a picture with a little tiny briefcase, and that is a free 3D print file that you can find from Dewey Cat Productions on Wargaming 3D, and I'm going to highly recommend that you go ahead and download that. I mean, the mad lads behind Dewey Cat Productions always do a really, really good job. They make it very easy to print stuff. I do both resin and FDM printing. And as somebody who owns filament printers and likes them for certain things and resin printers for other things, it is nice that they kind of design all their files to be both compatible. So, I would generally print small stuff like this on a resin printer. I decided just for kicks and grins to run it on an FDM printer, and it printed great. So highly recommend. You see it's that tiny little white dot right there in the middle. But in this case, in terms of preparations, first and foremost, it's important to note that there is a tiny addendum requirement in the scenario conditions that states that all units, including infiltrators, do have to start beyond 12 inches of the briefcase. And the reason for that is because the briefcase, which should be on a 25mm marker, is supposed to be located in the direct center of the board. So it is going to be just as far away from both armies as it is from either of the two sides. There's no leeway like we're going to find in our next one when we talk about demolition as to where you're allowed to place the marker, right? In this case, has to be placed in the center of the board. An infantry or artillery model that ends its activation, so note, not a vehicle, okay? So tanks cannot grab the objective because I guess the crew don't want to hop out, grab it, and then jump back in. And it's not at the end of the turn. It is at the end of their activation. If they end in base-to-base contact with the marker, then they pick it up. So it is transferred to the specific model who touched it. Now, I would say this matters a lot because, if it's some rando rifleman, taking him as a casualty would mean that you would drop it. But they do clarify that if that member of the unit is killed, then it's simply transferred over to another member of the unit. So in that sense, like my first reading, I'm not going to lie, when I first started reading 3rd edition, I was like, oh man, did they really, really close the loop on this? But sure enough, nope, they allow you to pass it up the chain. And so it means snipers are not going to be nearly as dangerous against this. Like there are certain gimmicks that come out of it. That being said, putting it on your sergeant or somebody who paid for a very expensive weapon, like a light machine gun or an assault rifle or a Panzerfaust or something like that, it might not be a bad idea to have that guy just jump into contact, because then you can at least say, hey, at least the carrier was protected, right? As long as we could. The only times you drop the objective is one, I guess if you choose to. It doesn't specifically say you can. There's no reason for you to drop it, but I guess technically, if you wanted to, maybe you could. I don't know. But the critical thing is you either have to have the whole unit be removed, so you shoot them up with shooting, or the whole unit is removed because they were defeated in close combat. Okay. And this is important because in the case of close combat, obviously in the case of a shooting attack, if the whole unit goes down, then it's just dropped where it is, right? Wherever the model is that had it, that's where it drops, okay? But in the case of a close combat unit, when they're defeated, it immediately transfers to one of the models that was involved in the close combat from the winning side. and then they perform their regroup move. So that means that if it's a standard infantry section, artillery can't actually do that because artillery crews have the fixed rule, and fixed units are not allowed to assault anymore. So, or at least to initiate an assault. Obviously, they can be assaulted and they fight normally, but they can't initiate one. So, I guess this would be for normal infantry sections, team weapons, things like that, that move in, they attack, and they're going to regroup either D6 inches, or in the case of cavalry, 2D6 inches away from everything, which would mean you could potentially get a good bit of movement off and moving the football, so to speak, back to your side of the board relatively quickly if you run them over with the right kind of unit. It's a very simple scenario. You win if you move it off of your deployment zone edge. Otherwise, the result is a draw. This is partially why a lot of people don't like Top Secret just the way it is, because there are so many ways it could go back and forth, or people play slower. There's just a lot of order dice to activate and people are taking their time, that you can very easily get a draw because you don't score whether you're holding it and maybe more points if you have it on in your deployment zone, or the most number of points if you get it off the board. That's not how you score. It's just, did one side get it off the board edge? And in the event that you can't get it off, you're going to be looking at a draw. Even if it was a tight game, there was good strategy, good tactics, it may not feel as rewarding to call it a draw. Okay. This also means it does reward swift grabbing of the objective. So a transport with a squad moving up on turn 1, or a mounted infantry unit moving up and grabbing it on turn 1, because notice it states you have to deploy beyond 12 inches. It does not state you have to deploy beyond, say, 18 inches in the case of cavalry, or beyond 24 inches in the case of guys with motorcycles or bicycles. And so if those guys perform a run order, in the case of the bicycles on a road, they could get to it on the first turn. Now, they do have to end their activation there. So it's not like you could start, 12.5 inches back with a cavalry unit, run up, grab it, and then move another 5.5 inches, right? And in this case, and the way that I try to design some of these elements of the board, it could be useful to include it in something like, say, a heavily fortified position like a trench, because then as a linear obstacle, people would have to advance in order to get over it. They can only run if they're trying to assault. Doesn't stop people with fieldcraft, doesn't stop, couple of other options, I guess a 12-inch move motorcycle, hypothetically, maybe couldn't advance over. There's something in my gut that tells me there's something else that can do it. Obviously, a transport that moves up from beyond 12 inches to within 6 inches, and then a unit advances out of it and then shoots and then claims the objective, that can also grab it. So there are ways to grab it even as early as turn 1. You're not going to be able to grab it, hoof it back into a transport or back towards your lines, and then continue running. That is not going to be possible. Okay. So the biggest thing to remember is that you need to protect your squads and you need to hunt enemy squads. It is still important to go after enemy armor, because enemy armor could try to remove whoever you have as your carrier, but they can't actually claim it. So the biggest threats for you are going to be those squads that are moving up to try to grab it. And so toward that end, which units tend to perform best? Wheeled and half-track transports, obviously, because they're going to allow you to get that quick strike in toward the center. Or if the enemy is able to grab it, they're the ones that are going to be helpful in chasing things down. Furthermore, if they can drop troops and then the following turn troops can mount back up on something like an advance order or something like that, then the transport can turn around and zip out of there, which is really nice. Mounted troops, as we just discussed, are also really nice. Cavalry, motorbikes, bicycles, because they have a chance of being able to grab it as early as turn 1. And if you're taking some of these guys at, say, veteran, and you can make sure that they have cover wherever it is that they end in base contact, then you can have a pretty good survivability to make it to the second round, as long as people don't have, something crazy that they can throw at you, a really heavy DACA tank or something like that that can try to remove you very easily. You got light and medium armor, also tend to do pretty well because they're durable, they're affordable. They also do tend to close the lanes for people to be able to fire on or assault the unit. So over there on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of the Char 2C. Now, the Char 2C is a bit of an extreme example because it is a very big tank. It is very tall. It is very long. It had a crew of between 10 and 12 people, which is insane. But hey, early war, nobody knew what they were doing, right? Still figuring out tanks. This is the first real tank war that existed. Yes, tanks were used in things like World War I. I think they were used in Spanish Civil War as well. And obviously there were designs for tanks and stuff like that used during the interwar period between, say, like when the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Prussians and Lithuanians are fighting against the Soviet Union. But in general, a lot of people have really weird, wonky ideas, and it was during World War II that a lot of those ideas got hammered out to what best practice is. But the result is that if you have a tank like this, it is useful because, one, it is relatively difficult to remove, which means it's an asset you can use to protect your own stuff and go after enemy stuff. Two, if they have a lot of firepower, which the Shark 2C does with, was that 4 machine guns and a light howitzer on top of that, that's a lot of different shots you can be taking. You can winnow down, especially if they're in your forward arc, whoever it is, what has the objective, because you've got a howitzer and 3 machine guns. 10 dice to try to hit with stuff is a pretty good chance you're going to hit with something. And then the question is just going to be, is there a high explosive damage weapon in there or not? So being able to do removal with them is really good. But in addition to that, and you'll notice this is where the size comes in and why I note how big and how long it is. If you had, say, that Moroccan Goumier squad, which is over next to it, and that's just using the normal Warlord Games French kit, plastic sprue kit. So to give you an idea on size of how big this thing is, if that squad was moving up and they were going to take the objective, and then you were to roll the Char 2C, admittedly it's slow, so it's not easy to do, in front of it to screen, it's not just that the squad would get heavy cover against attacks. There's a whole line there where you physically just can't see the squad from behind that tank. So taking these large, lumbering, often slow tanks, Char 2Cs, Tigers, Churchills, things like that, can be really advantageous because they can completely close off lines of fire. If the enemy is in that area, they literally can't see the unit that has the objective. They can destroy the tank, sure, because very often they're going to get a side shot on account of that's how you maximize the protection from the tank. But worst case scenario, they blow it up. That isn't scoring them any points. It creates impassable terrain that might make it harder for them to chase you down. And it's still heavy cover, even if they do end up finding a way slightly around you to try shooting at you, right? So these kinds of armor are quite nice because they can provide solid firepower while also providing protection for the guys who need to be protected. Okay. More kind of niche. It all depends on the board you're on. Amphibious vehicles can also be quite nice because, again, especially if you have an amphibial transport or an amphibious vehicle that has solid weapons on it for attack, it can be quite nice to be able to either go after enemy units by choosing a location and a route that other units may not be able to easily go, or to be able to get across, admittedly, typically at an advance rate, some sort of obstacle or something like that that would either dramatically slow the enemy or would require them to go around to something like a bridge. And all of that is fantastic. And then finally, perhaps surprisingly, because of the fact that they're not particularly good carriers, artillery and machine gun teams are really, really nice, mostly because they're a really good way of suppressing enemy units in order to protect your own units, okay? They either have solid volume of fire or decent removal that you can reliably pin down, if not actually remove enemy models, to winnow things down to prepare for your capturing of the objective or to keep people from reclaiming the briefcase objective. So what units are likely to struggle? First of all, mortars. Most notably because there really isn't a lot of standing still. You have very minimal ability to capture or contain the carrier, right? Because you can't assault the carrier. You don't really have a lot of frontage to be able to kind of block off where they can go without having to declare an assault, things like that. Like it's just really tricky with mortars to be able to use them effectively. Ironically, considering what I just talked about, it can also be difficult to get artillery to work because it can be relatively easy to escape the firing lanes. Now, I mentioned on the last slide, they can be quite effective for suppression. You will see here that here we have a French medium howitzer. Medium howitzers have not gotten a good showing so far this edition. They took a real beating coming over from second edition. So I don't necessarily rate them particularly high this edition, which sucks because I love howitzers. But you'll notice this is a really nice spot for it because it overlooks that same sandbag trench embankment where the objective is located. So any unit that's coming is probably going to get heavy cover, but they're going to have to come in range in order to see the howitzer. So the howitzer will get hopefully at least 1, maybe even 2 chances to try to remove models, which is excellent. So it's all about how you plan it. You need to plan it so that way you've got good firing lanes that are actually important to how the scenario plays. There are a lot of other firing arcs in this scenario, but not all of them are going to be important for actually salvaging and getting away the briefcase, right? Slow tanks are also going to find it hard because they may find it's difficult to get the positioning and the deployment that they want. Now, I mentioned the Char2C earlier. I'll be honest, you're probably going to have to do a lot of run orders with something like a Char2C, right? Just to be able to get up to where you need to be. And then you can do advances to kind of close the lane, close the gaps. That way you can make it work. But like, I'm not going to lie, it is going to be tricky in order to get maximum value out of slow tanks, just because they are not particularly good at maneuvering towards something. You kind of want to be working around them and then, flit behind them for cover. At which point then slow tanks tend to be really, really good. Small infantry teams are also not that great. Things like light mortar teams and AT rifle teams, because they're not particularly good at hunting carriers. They typically only get one shot. They aren't doing dramatic amounts of volume, which means they're not going to do a lot of wounds, which means they aren't going to get a lot past cover saves. And they're not very good carriers because they're relatively easily removed, right? So while you can run multiple small unit or MSU style armies in this kind of scenario, I do wonder what your mileage is going to be. So now deployment and terrain considerations. First of all, from a cover perspective, you want to be planning around central cover, right? Things that will protect your model, and then working toward deployment cover, because ultimately you're going to be, in an ideal world, running it back toward your part of the board. So you need to plan around that. So you'll notice over there on the right-hand side, we've got a VUDB Burlier. He's got 5 French Foreign Legion. They're the guys with the fun white caps. And then inside there's also a platoon commander, just to make sure that everything activates accurately. You'll notice that in terms of cover, the plan is, well, we're going to use this road as our avenue. 1, because it's a road, more on that later. But 2, because it's got pretty good heavy cover as well as a ruin on the way in. So that will just come purely block line of sight, which is nice. And then once the men are out and get into it, you have a pretty easy access back with cover going all the way back to the objective. That's the ideal thing. And then we've got that Char2C, we've got a Samua, and then of course there's your howitzer over there on the right-hand side, ready for protective follow-up after that. In terms of reserves, honestly, I wouldn't hold anybody in reserve. I think you get everybody on the board as quickly as possible, because you don't want, especially units and transports, to be counter deploying and then find that they can't really get to anything very quickly because the enemy swooped in, grabbed the objective. You weren't able to get rid of them because you didn't have as many tools on the board. And then they start booking it back toward their objective. Okay, that's no fun. So personally, I wouldn't leave a lot of people in reserve. Okay. In terms of roads, plan your road access for half-tracked and wheeled vehicles so that way they can be more effective. This Burlier is nicely placed because it's starting on a road. It's going to be able to continue on a road the whole way through. And within a 12-inch move, it can kind of poke out from around where that ruin is. It can start shooting down some range down fire. But because it's on a road, you can move up 24 inches with this thing. Start doing some downrange fire if you really needed to, and then just make sure you have the ability to pivot, turn around, so that way you can book it out of there on an advanced next turn. And that would get you most of the way down the board, right? And so this is the plan, right? And partially why people sometimes have problems with this scenario, because if in one turn, you're pounding away at units that are trying to get up with the Char2C, with the howitzer, with the Samua, and then the Burlier just runs up, drops out a 5-man veteran stubborn unit in heavy cover to grab that thing. And then you've got a platoon commander that hops out, provides some shooting fire downrange, but is really just there to make sure that both the Burlier and the Foreign Legion guys pass their test to get back into each other and run around back to start. Like, that squad is going to be really hard to dislodge, and you probably won't be able to assault them because a smart person will end on their side of the board, so to speak, touching that counter. So they'll be, you would be beyond 12 inches of them. In a situation like this, if you have to get over an obstacle, you would need fieldcraft cavalry, basically, in order to assault, which is extremely rare, right? So, things like that, I think roads are critical in this one. If there is a road and it's anywhere near the objective, you got to make sure you're planning that avenue. It would technically be safer for the Samua to actually be further over. But in this case, the strategy is we need that road clear. So that way the Burlier can do what it needs to do, ideally on the first turn, with a snap of the platoon commander, snapping the Burlier and the Foreign Legion. In terms of quick in and out, that is the plan, right? I mean, this is the whole strategy. It's grab the briefcase, screen the unit, give them cover, book it home. You are not there to remove units. You are not there to fight. I don't care how expensive your unit is. You are not there to fight. Okay, you are there to drop off the men and get home. You want distance over cover. There are going to be some times where you're going to be looking at it saying, I don't think I'm going to be able to save this unit, right? You know, they get shot up. You're down to like 3 models left in the unit or something like that. And you're like, man, there's a good chance there's going to be an assault coming. Or if I try to just hoof it so that way I'm out of assault range, then I'm going to be right smack dab in the middle of nowhere with no cover. My recommendation is drop the cover. Because worst case scenario, they shoot you up and you drop it where you end, right? You're dropping it where the unit got removed. Whereas if they can assault you and then they win, which is likely if you're down to that kind of scenario, then they're not only going to automatically pick it up, so they don't have to go any deeper into your territory. They're going to get a regroup move and they're going to start moving it further back. So when in doubt, especially if you have another infantry or artillery unit nearby that can pick it up, do not hesitate. Run as far as you can toward your end of the board, because worst case scenario, you're buying yourself time. They got to run all the way deeper into your side of the board to grab it. And it's not until the next turn that they can return. Remember, as far as I can tell, there's no handoff rule. There's no, if another one of your units ends in base contact with one of your units, you can hand it off, because we have an overarching bolt action rule that says your units are supposed to be in more than an inch from each other. So they're not allowed to do a handoff. Okay. So distance over cover. Get it as far to your side of the board as possible, unless there's a really nice spot in cover that also allows you to maximize that amount of distance. Okay. So what changes would I make to it? Honestly, the biggest issue again comes down to it's just so lopsided, right? You know, with skew rolls, it's so easy between order dice activation and somebody just rolling out of the box to remove units. It could just be so easy to just make it so that you get in there, you grab it, people don't wound you at all because they roll trash, and then you book it out of there, and then the game's basically over in 2 turns, right? So what I would do is I would do a couple of things. First of all, I would add additional tokens, because if you have to be guarding multiple objectives, it's not as easy to concentrate all of your effort and all of your firepower. You need more fast units, and all of that is excellent. I also think that adding limitations that would make the battle more interesting is also useful. So we cover a lot of these in the Zern mission back in Pool 6, is where they come from. So dossier recovery is literally just scoring as is, just in case you want to play a classic, token-based, one single token in the middle of the board style top secret mission. Fair enough. We've got it for you. It's right there. We also have raid, which I really like, where you're placing multiple resource tokens in your deployment zone. So you got to go really far across, and you end up scoring points based on whether, one, you have some of the enemy resource tokens in your possession. You could technically run in on the last turn, pick a bunch of them up, and you're technically scoring points, right? If it were to end right there. You get even more points if you have them beyond the enemy's deployment zone. So even if you move them just a little bit and you still have them, even if you have to go down every single turn in order to avoid being destroyed, you'd still be scoring something off of them. And you get even more if you drop them off in your deployment zone. Could be that they're either being physically held by one of your units, or we do have a mechanic that allows you at the end of your activation to just drop it if you want to. Okay. And so this way you have a lot of back and forth on both sides. You know, there's a lot of resources that are being fought over. I think each side has like 6 resource tokens. So there's a lot that you're fighting over, but it allows you to really have to work really hard at getting what you can actually get and trying to eke out points and being safe. It still rewards the exact same kinds of units, right? You know, units that are dropped off in a transport, can grab stuff, can jump back in and book it out of there, are going to do pretty well, but you're protecting a whole lot more. And so it makes it a lot more strategic. You got to figure out which ones can I afford to protect? Which ones do I just kind of have to roll the dice on and hope that they can't get to them and can't get over to them fast enough, right? You then have Lost Patrol. Lost Patrol is an interesting version of recovery because it's not an objective token. At the beginning of the game, you set aside one of your squads in a quarters deployment scenario, and one of those squads in the neutral zone is what's going to determine how much you score. At the end of the game, you're going to score points based on how many members of those squads you have left. So you can choose a 2-man AT rifle team as your Lost Patrol. Any infantry section works for this. And then you can start them over in the neutral zone, and then you can pull them back to your zone and you can hide them the entire game. if you want to score for 2 men. Alternatively, you could take a 20-man partisan guerrilla cell, all taken veteran, and that could be your squad, and you could run those guys back to your deployment zone. And if all 20 of them are still alive, there's a very good chance you won that game. But the trade-off with that is that there's going to be an incentive to not use that squad to fight, because the longer they're fighting, the more they're exposed to the enemy, the more models they're going to lose, and thus the total maximum number of points that you can score is going down. And so if you want to hide about a third of your army, quarter to a third of your army, depending on your points level, in your own deployment zone, I mean, have at it, right? That is a strategic decision. You might find that the enemy starts getting into your deployment zone. They're removing all your tools so that way they can keep their squad safe. And now they're in your deployment zone still fighting against that unit and chopping away at your advantage, right? There are questions here. But what this will do is, I suspect it will reward people who actually go for a more historical order of battle. Yeah, there's good solid math that says, 6 to 8, maybe 6 to 10, depending on the veterancy of your unit for what you want. But if you're only taking 5-6-man squads and you're trying to get a ton of them, you're also handicapping the number of points you can score for Lost Patrol, right? Because the biggest squad you could possibly choose might only be around 5 or 6 men. So there's a trade-off, right? Big squads, they may not get you as many pins every turn or even do as much removal every turn as 2 squads might do, but they might score you more points in this scenario. And I think that's interesting, especially in a tournament setting where you have multiple different scenarios going on. And so you can't just plan your list around one scenario. And then finally, and this one you can tell it's based off of Saving Private Ryan. This one's called Saving Private Clueless, where the objective is an infantryman for both sides. And the infantryman, he has a light machine gun. He doesn't suffer the penalty for shooting with the light machine gun, but he doesn't generate an order dice. So if you want to use him, if you want to activate him in a given turn, you have to choose not to activate one of your other units in exchange. And what this does, practically speaking, is you have to get him back from the neutral side, from the neutral zone back to your deployment zone or off the board edge in order to rescue him. One problem. The man has lost some friends and doesn't want to leave. Where have we heard of that before? And so the result is that you can't move him at a run order. So you can advance with him if you want to. If you want to move really slow, okay, you cannot move him at a run order until he has pins on him. Which is interesting because the opponent only scores the maximum number of points by getting their own guy back. And then the second highest number of points is if they can capture him in close combat, which of course doesn't apply pins. You get secondary points if you can just at least get him back to your, like deployment zone sort of stuff, or if you just remove him off the board, right? In which case that would be shooting at him, right? But of course, by shooting at him, if you're thinking, man, I don't think I can actually get to this guy, I'm going to have to try to remove him by shooting at him just to score something, it does mean he now speeds up, right? So there are aspects of this. It makes for a mobile moving condition, which is interesting. It's different, right? It also allows you, just to, attack on an extra LMG unit. It's not great. He's not the brightest or the strongest of fellows, but I do think it's interesting, right? It's different. And I do like that. And of course, like all of our pools, all of our scenarios do clarify the infiltrator deployment just to make it a little bit less, abusive in the case of those first wave deployment tactics and stuff like that. But just in general, I tend to think if you can add something extra, either extra objectives or other limitations that make you play the game a little bit differently, I think we can take this whole recovery concept and make it a little less lopsided, a little less skewed, right? Because I know that for some people, that can be less fun. And so what do you think? Do you think that these are overcomplicating something that really doesn't have to be that complicated? Are there other tips and recommendations for Top Secret that you would recommend? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.